The topic of this video is the moving of the Church of Assumption of the Virgin Mary, which was built in 1975 and is one of the dominant sites of Most. First, we need to say something about Most itself and the mining that is typical for the area and had a big influence of the existence of the church. Most is a town in northwestern Bohemia, in the district of Most in the Ústí region. The historic town was almost completely demolished in the 1970s and 1980s due to coal mining. The first mention comes from the Cosmo Chronicle of Bohemia from the 19th century. The name is derived from the trade route that ran through this area, where a fortress and settlement was established, Pons Nevin Justa Bellinam, or the Red Bridge over the White River. The bridge began to form as a town after 1240. At the end of the 13th century, Most has the characteristic form of a Gothic town and serves as a new economic and social legal unit. During the Přemyslet era, Most also became a town and began to become rich thanks to trade and wine growing. During the 30 Years' War, the city suffered great damage and thus lost its economic importance. A new phase of the city's development began in the 19th century when coal reserves were discovered and its mining began. In 1870, a railway was brought to the bridge. A sugar factory, porcelain factory, steel mill, brewery, or the town museum were built. The last quarter of the 19th century completely transformed the city. The population rose sharply and massive housing construction began. After the creation of Czechoslovakia, Most was among the cities with a majority German population. After the Munich Agreement, it and other Sudeten towns fell to the German Empire. During the Second World War, the city was heavily damaged by bombing raids by American bombers in their impressive attacks on a refinery in Záruba near Litvinov. After the war, most of the original German-speaking inhabitants were displaced. In 1964, the government issued a decision to liquidate the town over coal deposits, which began in 1967 and was completed in the 1980s. At the same time, the government decided to build a new Most. There was nothing left of the original town, with the exception of the Church of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary and new houses, and most of the population moved mostly to prefabricated houses. According to estimates, the liquidation of the old Most was economically worthwhile. It brought almost 3 billion crowns of the profit to the state. Over 89 million tons of quality brown coal were mined, which was roughly 89% of the reserves were located in this area. Mining in the pillar of the town of Most ended at the turn of 1990 and 1991. And now something about the Church of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, which was moved in the 1960s because of the mining. It is important to recall that its movement saved this monumental building from being demolished. This is a Gothic church which was built after the fire of the town in 1515 according to the plans of Reit's pupil Jakub Heilmann from Schweinfurt on the site of an early Gothic basilica. The original project was gradually changed by the builders of the church in the spirit of new opinions, until the late Gothic and Renaissance feeling of not only monumental architecture but also its detail was applied. Construction of the new temple dedicated to the Virgin Mary started in 1517 and lasted until the beginning of the 17th century. It is a large hall tripled with so-called drawn pillars, which enclose the space of individual circumferential chapels in the interior of the church and articulate the Emporium Gallery, decorated with polychrome Renaissance reliefs with biblical scenes. From the older church, only the crypt has been preserved to this day. In the second quarter of the 18th century, the eastern choir was closed by a monumental main altar, supplemented in the 70s by larger statues of sculptor Bartolomé Eder and paintings by Jesuit painter Josef. The counterweight of the altar was a large organ in the western part of the empory and an optical link set of statues of Christ and the Apostles by the Lobkowitz sculptor Jan Adam Dietz from the 1830s, mounted on the inner side of the pillars of the nave at the height of the empory.
In 1964, the gradual demolition of the old town of Most was approved, and a decision was made to build a new settlements in the undeveloped area south of the town. With this, the question of how to deal with the most important architectural monument here was also addressed. The Czechoslovak government's resolution number 612 of 18 November 1964 ordered that the Dean's Church would be saved during the mining of coal reserves under the town of Most. The decision was based on a detailed art historical survey of the building carried out by the State Institute of Monument Care and Natural Conservation in Prague. A total of 11 variants were drawn up on how to save the church. Among these variants was, for example, a plan to dismantle the church and its subsequent assembly at another location, or even to build a completely new church. The most suitable, though not the cheapest option, was eventually chosen to move the church as a whole a few hundred meters further into the neighborhood of the Gothic Church of the Holy Spirit and the Baroque Hospital. This, however, separated the church from the city itself by a corridor of transport and engineering networks. By the resolution of the Czechoslovak government, we decided to save the church by moving it. Before the start of the actual designing work, a detailed structural historical survey was carried out. In 1970, a depository was built where the dismantled furniture of the church, including the main altar and other part of the interior, were gradually stored. In 1971, an archaeological survey of the church and its immediate surrounding was carried out. In the following years, a detailed survey of the geological condition in the area of the church, on the transfer route and on the site of the new planning was gradually secured. During the processing of the project, other additional surveys were carried out, including finding out the physical and chemical properties of the historical building materials of the church, a geophysical project of the foundation of the church and of the cavities in the area of the temple and its immediate surrounding. In 1972, the church tower was dismantled because securing would require two demanding modifications and the complication during the transfer. The total weight of the church eventually amounted to 12,000 tons. The most expensive part of the preparatory work was the construction of the transport tracks. The track was only 160 meters long due to the greatest transport distance. It was then always dismantled behind the church, and during the transfer it was mounted 5 times in front of the church. Below all the statistically important points, 53 transport rails, manufactured by Škoda Pilsen, were inserted onto the built tracks. The trolleys worked on the hydraulic principle. The hydraulics also controlled 8 loading arms, which were supposed to push or break the church. The works were controlled by the main computer located in the control room. The control room was located directly in the church. It was formed by a glass extension on the front of the church, approximately 11 meters above the trackage, which was connected to the church by many kilometers of cables and hoses with liquid, which fed signals from the electromagnetic sensors placed in the church to the control computer in the control room and back to the control hydraulics after processing. From the control room, engineers and technicians controlled the shift of the church when maintaining a dynamic balance. On the 15th September 1975, the lifting and loading of the whole object began. The transfer itself started on the 30th September, 10 minutes before mid-noon. The track had an underground plan and was 841 meters long, with a slope of 1.23 degrees. The church moved along continuously at a speed of 1.2 to 3.2 centimeters per minute. The transfer was completed on 27th October 1975 at 8 o'clock 52 minutes, which means that the moving itself took 28 days. The stability of the building and its gradual renovation followed. A roof was laid, the tower was rebuilt and the interior restored. where the historic decoration of the 19th century walls was removed. The basic sacral elements, especially the main Baroque altar, was removed before the transfer, stored in the depository and gradually restored and then placed again. The church was reopened in 1988 and reconsecrated in June 1993.
As already mentioned, construction of a new city began at the same time as the demolition of the historic city. The new city of Most was to become a model of socialist architecture. Today, we know this style as socialist realism, or Surreala for short. New modern housing estates were being created here. The city had a rich infrastructure and there was no lack of cultural activities. For example, in 1967, the first North Bohemian youth enterprise was opened in Most, which was called Nepravda Club and which still exists today. In 1970, architect Václav Krejčí presented a plan for the completion of the center, where was to be located the Culture House, or the headquarters of the North Bohemian Brown Coal Mines, SHD shortly, which after construction became the tallest building in Czechoslovakia, if we exclude the cathedral in Pilsen and Olmos. The demolition didn't destroy everything. A little more than just the memories of the inhabitants have been preserved. There is a complete neighborhood of Zahražany, where there is an Art Nouveau buildings or First Republic villas, standing directly under the Hněvín Castle. On the square of the new town Most is located the original fountain, which together with sculptures of the fourth elements and several vases, standing in front of the museum, have been preserved in its original form. And there is also the Church of the Holy Spirit, which is the actual oldest preserved building in the city. It is an early Gothic building with a chapel, which still serves as a place for marriages. But of course, the Church of the Assumption is the greatest memento of the time. The church, which used to be rightfully located in the city center, now stands on the edge of the northern part of the city, about 1 kilometer from the local railway station. However, its position today does not diminish its importance. Many tourists who visit the city every year come here just to visit the church. The reason may be its importance. The church became a national cultural monument in 2010, but most visitors are naturally interested only in its story. But that's all that was preserved from the old town of Most. The place where the original town was located has been transformed beyond recognition. Today, we won't even find the open cast mine for which the town was demolished. The coal was mined, and as part of the reclamation, the lake Most was created. Now, the lake is spread over 3.11 square kilometers and took a long 6 years to fill. The town of Most was not the only town that had been destroyed because of brown coal mining. Only on the site of the former mine called Ležáky, now Lake Most, were several other villages, such as Konobrže, Pařidla or Střimice. However, there are still many functioning mines in the vicinity today, such as the ČSA mine, Bílina or Vršany mine. In all these places, there were many small villages that faced a similar fate as the town of Most. The story of the Church of the Assumption was interesting and unique, but the story of the old town of Most was just one of many stories where money and comfort mean more than several centuries of history and above all the lives and memories of many generations.